Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from. If these stories have become part of your nightly routine, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Now get comfortable, settle in, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin. In this new story, if you ask longtime residents across Appalachia about the safest way to travel the backroads after dark, most answers sound surprisingly ordinary. Keep your fuel tank above half, tell someone where you're going, watch for deer crossing the highway. But among retired truck drivers, volunteer firefighters, county deputies, and utility workers who have spent decades driving the mountains at night, another piece of advice quietly survives. If you decide to stop for a hitchhiker, pay close attention to everything they say. Years later, you may remember every word, even if you never understand why. Across Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, and eastern Tennessee, investigators have collected dozens of statements from motorists whose encounters with Appalachian hitchhikers share details too similar to dismiss completely. The witnesses never met one another. Most reported their experiences years apart. Yet many described conversations that sounded strangely familiar, as though they had all spent a few miles sharing the road with the same traveler. The earliest case that attracted serious attention occurred during October of 1998 outside Harlan County, Kentucky. 47-year-old Raymond Ellis worked as a regional power line inspector responsible for checking transmission equipment scattered throughout remote sections of the Appalachian Mountains. His job frequently required driving isolated county roads long after sunset, particularly following severe storms that damaged electrical infrastructure. Raymond knew nearly every highway, logging road, and abandoned mining route within 3 counties. Friends described him as practical, skeptical, and not the type of person to exaggerate unusual experiences. During more than 20 years with the utility company, he had filed hundreds of maintenance reports and never once submitted a complaint that investigators considered questionable. On the evening of October 22nd, Raymond completed emergency repairs near Cumberland shortly before 9 o'clock. Heavy rain had passed through the mountains earlier that afternoon, leaving patches of fog drifting across the valleys while temperatures dropped steadily toward freezing. Rather than returning by the interstate, Raymond followed Kentucky Route 160 because it shortened the drive home by nearly 30 minutes. Traffic was almost non-existent. Over the next 45 minutes, he encountered only 3 vehicles traveling in the opposite direction. After the last pickup disappeared behind him, the highway stretched completely empty beneath the headlights. Just before 10, Raymond rounded a long curve and noticed a man standing beside an old wooden fence where a narrow gravel road disappeared into the forest. The stranger appeared to be in his late 50s or early 60s, wearing a brown canvas jacket, faded work boots, and a dark felt hat pulled low across his forehead. He carried no backpack, suitcase, or camping gear. One hand rested inside his coat pocket, while the other remained raised just high enough to signal passing traffic. Raymond slowed instinctively. In the mountains, offering someone a ride on a cold October night was still considered the decent thing to do. When the passenger climbed inside, the first thing Raymond noticed was how clean his clothes appeared despite standing beside a muddy road after heavy rain. There was no water on his boots, no mud across the cuffs of his pants. He smelled faintly of wood smoke, the familiar scent of fireplaces common throughout Appalachian homes each autumn. Raymond asked where he was headed. The man smiled politely before answering, just far enough to get home. His voice was calm, almost comforting, carrying the slow mountain accent Raymond had grown up hearing from older relatives. The conversation that followed felt remarkably ordinary. They spoke about the decline of coal mining, families moving away from small towns, and how quiet the mountains had become compared with 30 years earlier. The stranger displayed detailed knowledge of local communities, mentioning churches that no longer held Sunday services and schools that had closed decades before. Several times, he referred to places using names that Raymond remembered hearing only from elderly residents. Nothing about the discussion sounded unnatural. If anything, Raymond later admitted he enjoyed the company. It reminded him of conversations with his late grandfather during childhood. After nearly 20 minutes, the hitchhiker pointed toward an overgrown lane barely visible between two stone fence posts. Raymond almost missed the entrance entirely. No mailbox marked the property. No lights appeared beyond the trees. According to the highway map folded inside his glove compartment, no maintained road existed there at all. Raymond slowed anyway. The stranger thanked him for the ride before placing one hand on the door handle. Then, just before stepping out, he quietly said something Raymond would repeat to investigators for the rest of his life. "If anyone asks who you picked up tonight, tell them you never learned my name." Raymond found the sentence odd because they had never exchanged names in the first place. Before he could respond, the man closed the truck door and walked into the darkness without looking back. Raymond watched him through the side mirror for several seconds until the figure disappeared behind the trees. Satisfied that his passenger had reached wherever he intended to go, Raymond continued toward home. The following afternoon, he mentioned the encounter while having lunch with two coworkers. One of them immediately asked where he had dropped the hitchhiker. Raymond described the location as accurately as possible, including the stone fence posts and the hidden lane. Neither coworker said anything for several moments. Finally, the older of the two quietly explained that the lane once led to a farming community abandoned after severe flooding during the early 1970s. The final house had been demolished years before Raymond started working for the utility company. Today, according to county property records, nothing remained beyond the fence except reclaimed woodland. Raymond dismissed the story until curiosity convinced him to drive back the following weekend during daylight. The stone fence posts were exactly where he remembered. So was the narrow opening between them. But once he walked beyond the entrance, the lane disappeared after less than 50 yards beneath dense undergrowth. Fallen trees blocked the path completely. It would have been impossible for anyone to walk through the forest without leaving obvious signs of movement. Raymond searched for nearly an hour. He found no house, no cabin, and no evidence that anyone had lived there for decades. The only structure remaining was a weathered stone chimney standing alone among the trees. Several months later, Raymond attended a community fundraiser where he casually shared the story with a retired county deputy. The deputy listened without interrupting before asking one unexpected question. Did he smell like wood smoke? The retired deputy waited until everyone else had left the table before answering. He stirred his coffee slowly without looking up. "You're not the first man who's described him that way," he said quietly. "Brown jacket, felt hat, smells like wood smoke, talks like he's known these mountains his whole life." Raymond smiled politely, assuming the deputy was joking. The older man never smiled back. Instead, he reached into his wallet and removed a folded newspaper clipping that had become soft around the edges after years of being carried. The headline described a traffic collision from 1984 involving a pickup truck and an overloaded logging trailer on Route 160, less than 5 miles from where Raymond had picked up the hitchhiker. 3 people died that night. One of them was identified as Walter Dean Lawson, a 61-year-old retired miner who had been walking home after his truck broke down along the highway. Raymond immediately pointed toward the black and white photograph printed beside the article. The face looked older than the man he remembered meeting, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The same narrow jaw, the same deep-set eyes. Even the dark felt hat appeared identical. The deputy folded the clipping and slipped it back into his wallet before explaining why he kept it. During his 28 years with the sheriff's department, 5 different motorists had independently described giving a ride to a man matching Walter Lawson's appearance. None of those witnesses knew one another, none had seen the newspaper article before contacting law enforcement. More importantly, every one of them insisted the hitchhiker asked to be dropped off somewhere along the same stretch of highway. Officially, the sheriff's office treated every report as mistaken identity. Rural Appalachia was filled with older men who dressed similarly, worked outdoors, and carried themselves with the quiet confidence of lifelong mountain residents. The explanation sounded reasonable enough, yet the deputy admitted one detail never fit. Every witness described Walter speaking about local places that no longer existed. One remembered an elementary school demolished nearly 20 years earlier. Another recalled Walter asking whether the coal tipple near Lynch was still operating even though it had closed decades before. Raymond suddenly remembered his own conversation inside the truck. Walter had spoken about a church picnic held every Labor Day in a hollow that no longer had a church. At the time, Raymond assumed he was remembering old traditions. Now he wasn't so sure. The story might have remained nothing more than local folklore had another report not surfaced 6 years later in neighboring Virginia. During November of 2004, 42-year-old commercial salesman Michael Turner was driving south after a week of business meetings in Charleston, West Virginia. Heavy rain forced him off the interstate onto smaller mountain highways where traffic became increasingly sparse after dark. Around 9:30, he spotted an older man standing beneath a weathered road sign outside a tiny community near Pound Gap. Michael rarely picked up strangers, but the temperature had fallen close to freezing, and the man appeared calm rather than desperate. He unlocked the passenger door and offered him a ride. Michael later described the conversation almost exactly as Raymond had years earlier. The hitchhiker spoke fondly about mountain families helping one another during difficult winters. He knew the names of creeks, abandoned company stores, and long-forgotten baseball fields where mining towns once held summer tournaments. At one point, the stranger looked out the passenger window and quietly remarked, "Funny how fast people forget places once the buildings disappear." Michael remembered the sentence because it seemed strangely personal, as though the man wasn't talking about towns at all. After nearly half an hour, the hitchhiker asked to be dropped off beside a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. There were no houses nearby, no driveway, no visible destination. Before stepping out, the man thanked Michael for stopping and added one final sentence: "You won't have any trouble crossing tonight." Michael thought nothing of the remark until the next morning, when he learned a rock slide had closed that same bridge less than 30 minutes after he crossed it. State transportation records confirmed the highway remained blocked for almost 18 hours. Had he arrived only a little later, he would have been stranded until sunrise. Unlike Raymond, Michael never contacted law enforcement. Instead, he mentioned the encounter during a historical society meeting several months later while discussing old Appalachian communities. An elderly volunteer immediately interrupted him and asked whether the hitchhiker smelled like smoke from a fireplace. Michael answered yes. The room fell noticeably quiet. Two other attendees exchanged uncomfortable glances before one admitted hearing almost the same story from his brother nearly 15 years earlier. Different county, different decade, the same calm voice. The same worn jacket, the same strange knowledge of places erased from modern maps. Interest in the reports eventually reached Dr. Elaine Porter, a transportation historian at a university in eastern Kentucky, studying the decline of rural travel throughout central Appalachia. Unlike paranormal investigators, Porter focused entirely on documented evidence. She collected witness statements, archived newspaper articles, weather reports, and highway maintenance records covering nearly 40 years. Her goal was not to prove ghost stories. She wanted to understand why remarkably similar accounts kept appearing in communities separated by hundreds of miles. After reviewing dozens of reports, Porter noticed something investigators had overlooked. The hitchhiker never asked drivers to leave the highway. He never directed them toward isolated trails or abandoned buildings. In every case, he encouraged them to continue traveling safely before quietly ending the ride. Whatever people believed they encountered, the stranger never attempted to harm anyone. Porter's research concluded with a sentence that surprised many readers. Whether these witnesses encountered the same individual, repeated cases of mistaken identity, or stories shaped by Appalachian tradition, one fact remains unusually consistent. Every driver remembered the conversation in extraordinary detail, even decades later. Memory specialists later suggested emotionally unusual encounters often become permanently fixed in the human mind. Perhaps that alone explained why so many accounts sounded alike. Or perhaps there was another reason. Today, if you travel the back roads stretching through eastern Kentucky, southwestern Virginia, or southern West Virginia, you'll occasionally meet lifelong residents who still stop for stranded motorists despite the risks. Ask them why, and many will shrug before saying that mountain people have always looked after one another. Ask whether they've ever heard the story about the older hitchhiker wearing the brown jacket, and the conversation often becomes quieter. Some will tell you it's only local folklore. Others will insist a relative once met someone matching that exact description. Almost all of them will repeat the same advice. If an older traveler thanks you for the ride, listen carefully to what he says before getting out. Years from now, you may discover that it wasn't the road you remembered most clearly, it was the conversation. In this new story, for most Americans, hitchhiking belongs to another era. During the 1960s, 70s, and even into the early 80s, it was common to see travelers standing beside rural highways, carrying backpacks, duffel bags, or cardboard signs listing their destinations. Today, the practice has nearly disappeared, replaced by smartphones, ride-sharing apps, and growing concerns about personal safety. Yet, across Appalachia, where isolated roads still connect hundreds of small communities, sheriff departments continue receiving occasional reports involving hitchhikers whose stories leave investigators with more questions than answers. Some reports involve stranded travelers. Others involve motorists who later insisted they picked up someone who seemed perfectly ordinary until the journey took an unexpected turn. The following case remains one of the strangest ever documented along the back roads of eastern Kentucky. During the final week of October 2017, 49-year-old Daniel Brooks left Pikeville, Kentucky, shortly after sunset following a routine maintenance inspection at a communications tower. Daniel had worked as a field technician for nearly 20 years and often drove remote mountain roads long after dark. Friends described him as practical, patient, and difficult to rattle. His truck contained emergency supplies, extra fuel, recovery equipment, and printed county maps in case his navigation system failed. He had traveled nearly every road in eastern Kentucky and believed there were very few surprises left in the Appalachian Mountains. Around 8:45 that evening, Daniel entered Kentucky Route 80 while taking a shortcut toward Prestonsburg. Traffic was unusually light. During nearly 30 minutes of driving, he encountered only two other vehicles. Autumn leaves covered the shoulders, while patches of low fog settled inside narrow valleys below the highway. The temperature had fallen into the upper 30s, making it unlikely anyone would be walking along such an isolated road. That assumption changed when Daniel rounded a sharp curve and saw a man standing beside an old wooden guardrail illuminated by his headlights. The stranger appeared to be in his late 60s. He wore a faded brown jacket, denim overalls, and carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder. He did not wave frantically or step into the roadway. Instead, he simply raised one hand as Daniel approached. Years working throughout rural Appalachia had taught Daniel that helping stranded travelers was still common in many mountain communities. He slowed, unlocked the passenger door, and asked where the man was headed. The stranger smiled politely before answering, just a little farther down the road. His voice was calm, almost reassuring, with the slow Appalachian accent Daniel had heard throughout his childhood. As they continued driving, the conversation remained surprisingly ordinary. The man introduced himself only as Walter and claimed he had been visiting relatives in a nearby hollow after attending a funeral earlier that afternoon. He spoke about abandoned coal camps, old churches disappearing from the mountains, and how many young people had moved away searching for work. Nothing about the discussion seemed unusual. Daniel later told investigators that Walter sounded exactly like dozens of older residents he had met during years working throughout eastern Kentucky. If anything, he seemed grateful simply to have someone willing to talk during a lonely drive through the mountains. After nearly 15 minutes, Walter pointed toward a narrow gravel road branching away from the highway. There were no reflective signs, no visible houses, and no mailbox identifying the road. Daniel slowed before asking whether anyone actually lived there. Walter quietly nodded and replied, "Used to be a whole community." The answer struck Daniel as oddly phrased. Before he could ask another question, Walter looked toward the dark forest beyond the windshield and added, "Most folks don't stop around here anymore, probably for the best." Daniel offered to drive him farther down the gravel road, but Walter immediately declined. Instead, he asked to be dropped off exactly where the pavement ended. Daniel stopped beside a rusted cattle gate partially hidden beneath vines. Walter thanked him, stepped from the truck, and walked slowly into the darkness carrying the same small canvas bag. Daniel watched through the side mirror until the man disappeared beyond the gate. Satisfied that his passenger had reached home safely, he continued toward Prestonsburg. Less than 5 minutes later, his truck radio suddenly filled with heavy static before clearing on its own. He thought little of it until reaching home later that evening. The following weekend, Daniel mentioned the encounter while working with another technician who had lived in the area his entire life. When he described dropping an older man named Walter near the abandoned gravel road, his coworker became unusually quiet. After several moments, he asked Daniel whether the man had been wearing brown overalls and carrying a faded canvas bag. Daniel answered yes without hesitation. His coworker then explained that the description matched Walter Hensley, a retired coal miner who had died from a heart attack nearly 12 years earlier. At first, Daniel laughed, assuming someone else shared the same name. His coworker insisted there had never been another Walter Hensley living in that hollow. Curiosity eventually led Daniel to the Floyd County Historical Society, where volunteers maintained newspaper archives and cemetery records. They located Walter Hensley's obituary from November 2005. The accompanying photograph showed an older man wearing denim overalls and smiling exactly as Daniel remembered. Even the canvas bag hanging from Walter's shoulder appeared in one family photograph donated decades earlier. According to surviving relatives, the abandoned gravel road once led to a small mining settlement completely abandoned after flooding during the early 1990s. Today, little remained except broken foundations hidden beneath the forest. No permanent residents had lived there for years. Daniel never claimed he had encountered anything supernatural. During interviews, he consistently stated that he believed he had given a ride to a real person, someone with a normal voice, ordinary conversation, and detailed knowledge of the surrounding communities. Yet investigators could not explain how Walter disappeared so quickly after leaving the truck, why no other residents matched the description, or why Daniel accurately described personal details never mentioned until he later viewed the archived obituary. The sheriff's office found no evidence of criminal activity and officially closed the inquiry without further action. Stories like Daniel's continue circulating throughout Appalachia, often dismissed as misunderstandings, mistaken identity, or memories shaped by lonely mountain roads after dark. Most likely, there are perfectly reasonable explanations for every detail. Even so, experienced deputies, volunteer firefighters, and lifelong residents quietly share one piece of advice with newcomers exploring the backroads at night. If you decide to stop for a hitchhiker, pay close attention to where they ask you to let them out. Because sometimes the destination is no longer there, and sometimes the person thanking you for the ride has already been part of Appalachian history for many years. What hikers reported deep in the wilderness still doesn't make sense. In late summer of 2011, several unrelated hikers reported nearly identical experiences deep within a remote section of western North Carolina. Their accounts were recorded months apart, yet many details appeared unusually consistent. Dispatch logs, archived ranger notes, and later witness interviews preserved fragments of those reports, though investigators never reached a conclusion that satisfied everyone involved. One of the earliest reports came from Corbin Voss, a 37-year-old survey technician from Tennessee who spent weekends hiking remote trails. He entered the Pisgah region alone during a 3-day backpacking trip and planned to document several abandoned logging routes. According to trail records, he checked in at a ranger station shortly after sunrise and appeared calm before beginning his hike. Weather conditions remained stable throughout the day, and no warnings had been issued for that section of forest. Corbin covered nearly 12 miles before establishing camp near a narrow ridge overlooking a heavily wooded valley. He later stated that nothing unusual occurred until shortly after dusk when distant sounds began echoing through the trees. At first, he assumed another group occupied a nearby campsite, though no fires or lights appeared anywhere below him. The sounds reportedly resembled brief conversations carried by wind, yet every attempt to identify their source failed. Around 10 that evening, Corbin heard what he believed were footsteps approaching from the eastern side of camp. The movement stopped whenever he shined his flashlight toward the trees. Several minutes later, the same pattern repeated from a different direction. He described the experience in a written statement submitted after returning home. According to archive notes, he eventually remained awake until dawn because the sounds continued at irregular intervals. The following morning revealed no obvious explanation. Corbin found no footprints near his campsite, despite damp soil that should have preserved tracks clearly. He also noticed something that later became important during the investigation. Several small stones had been arranged beside the trail leading away from camp. The formation appeared deliberate, though investigators later suggested natural causes could not be ruled out. Corbin photographed the stones before continuing his hike deeper into the wilderness. Approximately 4 months later, a second report emerged from a woman named Tessa Crowley, a 42-year-old physical therapist from Virginia. She visited the same general region while training for a long-distance hiking event. Tessa reportedly knew nothing about Corbin's experience. Nevertheless, her statement contained details that closely matched information contained within county files from earlier reports. Rangers noticed the similarities only after reviewing records during the following year. Tessa spent 2 nights in the forest and described hearing distant voices after dark. She could never distinguish actual words, though the sounds consistently resembled conversations taking place beyond visual range. During her second evening, she reportedly heard footsteps circling her campsite for nearly an hour. Whenever she moved toward the noise, complete silence followed immediately. Investigators later confirmed that no other hikers had registered nearby during that period. The most unusual detail appeared shortly before sunrise. Tessa woke unexpectedly and discovered several stones arranged near a fallen log approximately 30 yards from camp. She later claimed the arrangement had not been present before darkness arrived. Archived ranger notes from 2012 mention photographs taken at the scene, though some records indicate those images were later misplaced. Investigators never confirmed whether the stones had any connection to other reports. As similar accounts accumulated, officials began examining earlier records stored in regional archives. A county file from 2009 referenced a search and rescue volunteer who described hearing distant conversations while assisting during a missing person operation. Another report from 2007 mentioned unexplained footsteps around a temporary camp established by forestry workers. Although details varied, recurring elements appeared often enough to attract attention from local authorities. By 2013, discussions about the reports reached several outdoor organizations operating throughout the Appalachian region. Some members believed environmental conditions created auditory distortions capable of producing convincing illusions. Others pointed toward wildlife activity, arguing that unfamiliar sounds frequently become exaggerated after darkness settles across remote landscapes. Investigators explored both possibilities, yet neither explanation accounted for every detail contained within witness statements. Records conflict regarding several observations, leaving significant gaps in the timeline. One incident from that year generated particular interest. A pair of hikers named Leland Burke and Owen Mercer entered the wilderness for a weekend photography trip. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who routinely traveled through isolated terrain. According to their statements, they heard voices shortly after sunset while preparing dinner beside a stream. Neither individual could identify specific words, though both agreed the sounds resembled a conversation occurring just beyond sight. Leland later reported seeing a light moving slowly between distant trees across the valley. The light appeared briefly before disappearing behind thick vegetation. Owen claimed he never observed it directly, creating one of several conflicting details found throughout the case. Investigators never confirmed whether another group occupied the area that night. Searches conducted afterward located no campsites, discarded equipment, or evidence suggesting recent human activity nearby. The following morning produced another familiar discovery. Several stones rested beside the trail leading away from their campsite. Unlike previous reports, the arrangement formed a rough line extending toward denser forest. Leland photographed the scene and submitted copies during a later interview. Some locals claimed similar markers occasionally appeared throughout remote sections of the region. Investigators never confirmed those accounts and found little supporting documentation. As years passed, additional reports continued appearing within archive notes and ranger files. Many involved experienced hikers who demonstrated familiarity with wilderness conditions. Most accounts described sounds rather than visual encounters. Voices remained the most common element, followed closely by footsteps approaching campsites after dark. While each report contained differences, enough similarities existed to keep the mystery alive among those familiar with regional records. Researchers examining the case proposed several theories. Certain environmental specialists suggested unusual terrain features might reflect sound across valleys in unexpected ways. Under specific conditions, conversations occurring miles away could reportedly seem much closer than reality. Wildlife experts offered alternative explanations involving nocturnal animals whose calls occasionally resemble human voices. Neither theory addressed the recurring stone arrangements mentioned across multiple reports, separated by years and involving unrelated witnesses. A review conducted during 2019 attempted to organize every available statement into a single timeline. Investigators compared dispatch logs, archive notes, witness interviews, and state records gathered over more than a decade. Their findings revealed no evidence of criminal activity, organized hoaxes, or coordinated fabrication. However, they also failed to identify any explanation capable of connecting every reported detail. Several key documents referenced observations that could no longer be verified because supporting material had disappeared. Today, hikers continue traveling through the same wilderness without incident every year. Most never experience anything unusual and return home with ordinary stories about mountain views and long trails. Yet, scattered among those routine accounts remain a small number of reports that sound remarkably similar to statements recorded years earlier. Investigators never confirmed what caused the voices, the footsteps, or the carefully placed stones. Deep within that section of forest, what several hikers reported still doesn't make sense. In this new story, every July, millions of Americans leave home believing the most dangerous part of their vacation will be heavy traffic, bad weather, or a flat tire somewhere along an unfamiliar highway. Most return with photographs, souvenirs, and stories they'll happily tell for years. Others return with experiences they rarely mention, not because no one would believe them, but because they still cannot explain what happened. Over the last 4 decades, sheriff departments, state police agencies, and local newspapers across the United States have quietly documented dozens of unusual reports connected to July road trips. None were ever officially linked together. different states, different highways, different families. Yet, investigators reviewing the records years later noticed something unsettling. Every witness insisted their trip changed forever after making one decision they believed was completely ordinary. The first case began during the second week of July 2015. Robert and Lisa Campbell had spent nearly 6 months planning a 2-week road trip from Missouri to Yellowstone National Park. Both were recently retired school teachers who preferred scenic backroads over busy interstates. Their travel journal, recovered months later by relatives, documented nearly every stop along the journey, including restaurants, fuel receipts, hiking trails, and conversations with local residents. It would eventually become one of the most detailed records investigators had available. On July 10th, shortly after leaving eastern Wyoming, the couple stopped at a small family-owned diner where another customer suggested a little-known scenic highway that crossed hundreds of miles of open prairie before reconnecting with the interstate farther north. According to him, the drive offered spectacular sunsets and almost no traffic. Robert marked the route inside his paper atlas before thanking the man. Security footage later confirmed the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No one ever identified the traveler who recommended the road. The first 100 miles were exactly as promised. Endless grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, while the evening sun painted the horizon deep shades of orange and gold. Robert stopped several times to photograph abandoned barns, windmills, and grazing antelope. Lisa continued writing inside her travel journal, describing the highway as one of the quietest roads they had ever driven. Shortly before sunset, she noted something unusual. They had not passed another moving vehicle for nearly 40 minutes, despite traveling during the busiest vacation month of the year. Around 8:30, they reached a weathered service station standing alone beside the highway. Its fuel pumps had been removed years earlier, but the building itself appeared occupied. An elderly woman sweeping the front porch smiled and asked whether they were heading north. When Robert answered yes, she quietly suggested they continue driving until reaching the interstate without stopping again, regardless of what they might see along the road. Lisa later wrote the warning in her journal, adding that the woman refused to explain further before wishing them a safe trip. It seemed like an odd conversation, but neither considered it especially important at the time. Just after darkness settled across the prairie, Robert noticed headlights appearing several miles behind them. The vehicle never seemed to get closer, despite maintaining exactly the same speed for nearly 20 minutes. Whenever Robert slowed slightly, the distant headlights slowed as well. When he accelerated, they accelerated too. Curious, he eventually pulled onto the shoulder, expecting the other driver to pass. Instead, the headlights stopped almost half a mile away and remained perfectly still. After waiting several minutes, Robert returned to the highway. The distant lights resumed, following at exactly the same distance. They reached the interstate shortly before 10 and immediately noticed the headlights disappear. Relieved, they continued toward Billings without discussing the incident further. The following morning, while reviewing photographs from the previous evening, Lisa discovered something unexpected. One image captured during sunset clearly showed the highway stretching behind their vehicle for several miles. There were no headlights anywhere on the road. The timestamp matched the exact period when both insisted another vehicle had been following them. Photography specialists later confirmed the image showed no signs of digital alteration. The second case occurred 3 years later during July 2018 in northern Maine. Brothers Kevin and Thomas Riley planned a fishing trip near the Canadian border. Their route crossed long stretches of forest where gas stations became increasingly rare after sunset. Shortly after 9, they stopped at a lonely convenience store to buy coffee and ask about the quickest route to their rented cabin. The cashier looked toward the parking lot before asking whether they had seen an older green station wagon parked outside. Both brothers turned toward the windows. The parking lot contained only their pickup truck. When they answered no, the cashier quietly apologized and changed the subject. Less than an hour later, Kevin noticed an older green station wagon parked beside the highway with its hood raised. Assuming someone needed assistance, he slowed almost to a stop. Before either brother could open the doors, another pickup traveling in the opposite direction repeatedly flashed its headlights. The driver leaned out his window and shouted only three words, "Keep driving now." Kevin accelerated without hesitation. When they glanced back through the rear window, less than 30 seconds later, the station wagon had disappeared. The shoulder where it had been parked stretched empty beneath the moonlight. State police later confirmed no disabled vehicles were reported anywhere along that section of highway that evening. The final case came from southern West Virginia during July 2022. Emily Foster, a travel nurse from North Carolina, accepted a temporary assignment in Charleston and decided to spend several days exploring small Appalachian towns before beginning work. Unlike the previous witnesses, Emily carried a dashboard camera recording continuously throughout the trip. Shortly after entering an isolated mountain highway, she encountered a handwritten detour sign directing traffic away from ongoing bridge repairs. The route eventually led through a nearly abandoned coal community where every storefront appeared empty except one small grocery store still displaying fresh produce outside the entrance. Emily purchased bottled water, spoke briefly with the elderly owner, and continued driving. The receipt recovered from her wallet showed the purchase occurred at 4:23 that afternoon. 3 weeks later, curious about the unusual town, Emily attempted to revisit the grocery store while returning home. She never found it. Local residents insisted no grocery had operated there for nearly 15 years. Historical records later confirmed the building had been destroyed during a flood long before Emily claimed to have stopped there. Even more puzzling, the bottled water she purchased remained inside her vehicle, bearing the faded store label investigators could not match to any currently registered business in West Virginia. The receipt identified a tax registration number belonging to a company officially dissolved in 2016. No explanation accounted for how she obtained either item. Years later, a transportation researcher comparing unusual travel reports noticed an unexpected connection linking all three cases. None involved violence, none resulted in disappearances. Every traveler returned home safely, yet each witness received an unexplained warning from a stranger shortly before experiencing something investigators could never verify. The warnings differed only slightly. Keep driving. Don't stop. Stay on the highway. Reach the interstate before dark. No official investigation ever determined why those warnings appeared so consistently across different states separated by thousands of miles. Perhaps they meant nothing at all. Or perhaps every July, somewhere along America's loneliest highways, ordinary travelers unknowingly pass through places where experienced locals understand one simple rule far better than any map ever could. In this new story, the Carter family had lived in the same narrow Appalachian hollow for nearly 12 years before anything unusual ever happened. Their weathered farmhouse rested between steep forested ridges where sunlight disappeared long before evening reached nearby towns. Only 4 other homes stood within several miles, separated by winding gravel roads and dense hardwood forests that seemed to swallow every sound after sunset. The isolation had always been part of the appeal because the family preferred quiet lives away from crowded highways and expanding suburbs. Neighbors often described the hollow as peaceful, despite its reputation among older residents who quietly admitted they avoided walking those woods after dark. Spring arrived later than expected during that particular year. Cold mornings lingered well into April, leaving thick patches of fog trapped along the valley floor until midday. The Carter family continued their daily routines without noticing anything out of place. David worked maintenance at a nearby lumber mill, while his wife Karen managed the property and homeschooled their youngest daughter. Their older son often hunted turkey before sunrise, returning with stories about deer trails, black bears, and distant owls. Nothing in those conversations hinted that the family would soon become the subject of whispered discussions throughout neighboring communities. The first strange incident appeared so ordinary that nobody thought it deserved much attention. Shortly after midnight, one calm Tuesday, Karen woke because someone seemed to be slowly walking across the gravel driveway outside their bedroom window. The footsteps remained steady without rushing or hesitating. She assumed a neighbor needed help with a broken truck because emergencies sometimes happened in remote mountain communities. David pulled aside the curtain, expecting headlights or flashlights. Instead, he found only darkness stretching across the yard beneath a cloud-covered sky. The footsteps stopped the moment he looked outside, leaving complete silence behind. The following evening, everything remained perfectly normal until almost the exact same time. Again, the slow footsteps crossed the driveway. Again, they sounded close enough to identify individual stones shifting beneath heavy boots. David immediately stepped onto the porch carrying a flashlight. The beam reached the tree line without revealing anyone. Fresh dew covered the gravel, yet no footprints appeared anywhere across the driveway. The woods surrounding the farmhouse remained unusually still. Even insects seemed quieter than expected for that season, something David mentioned only after returning indoors. By the end of the week, every member of the family except the youngest daughter had heard the footsteps. Each person described the same deliberate pace. Nobody reported running, stumbling, or changing direction. Whatever produced the sound seemed to walk directly toward the front porch before stopping several feet short of the steps. Then, absolute silence followed. The family waited behind darkened windows several nights, hoping to catch whoever might be playing an elaborate prank. No figure ever appeared despite the unmistakable sound approaching the house with remarkable consistency. Weeks passed before another detail entered the story. Their closest neighbor, who lived almost 2 miles away, casually mentioned hearing someone walking outside his barn after midnight. He assumed raccoons had climbed across stored equipment until he noticed these sounds resembled measured human footsteps rather than animal movement. When David described similar experiences, the neighbor grew noticeably uncomfortable. He admitted older relatives once warned him never to investigate unexplained footsteps echoing through mountain hollows during unusually quiet nights. Those warnings came without explanations because previous generations rarely discussed such experiences openly. David dismissed the conversation as local folklore, even though the timing unsettled him. Rural Appalachian communities preserved countless stories passed through families for generations. Most involved cautionary tales meant to keep children away from abandoned mines, unstable cliffs, or unfamiliar strangers. He believed these newer rumors probably served the same purpose. Nevertheless, he installed brighter floodlights around the farmhouse and checked every window before sleeping. The lights illuminated nearly every corner of the property, making it difficult for anyone to approach unnoticed. Despite those changes, the footsteps continued exactly as before. Summer brought warmer temperatures and longer evenings. Friends visited for weekend cookouts, often staying well past sunset. Nothing unusual happened whenever guests remained outside. The strange sounds appeared only after everyone else had left and the family settled into bed. One visitor later remarked that the property felt unusually peaceful compared with neighboring valleys because almost no highway noise reached the hollow. Karen privately wondered whether that silence simply made ordinary nighttime sounds seem more disturbing. She tried convincing herself the explanation was psychological, yet every repeated incident chipped away at that confidence. One humid July night, the pattern unexpectedly changed. Instead of stopping near the porch, the footsteps slowly circled the entire farmhouse. Each family member listened while the unseen walker completed what sounded like a careful inspection around every exterior wall. Wooden boards occasionally creaked beneath invisible weight. Gravel shifted beside basement windows. Dry leaves rustled near the back entrance. David opened the rear door before the sounds reached that side of the house. Nothing stood beneath the floodlights except motionless trees swaying gently in the warm night air. Karen began recording dates and times inside a notebook. She hoped documenting each occurrence might reveal a logical pattern connected to weather, wildlife, or nearby activity. After several months, she noticed most incidents happened during calm evenings without strong wind or rain. The sounds almost never appeared during storms. They also seemed concentrated between midnight and 2 in the morning. Those observations fascinated David because they suggested consistency rather than random imagination. Still, neither explanation nor physical evidence emerged despite careful attention. In this new story, long before GPS-guided drivers through the Appalachian Mountains, locals in southern West Virginia relied on narrow county roads connecting mining towns hidden between steep ridges. Many of those roads still exist today, winding through dense forests where abandoned coal camps slowly disappear beneath moss and vines. Most are perfectly safe during daylight. Yet, according to sheriff reports, volunteer search records, and decades of local newspaper archives, a handful of isolated locations continue attracting incidents that investigators have never fully explained. They are not officially closed. No warning signs tell visitors to stay away after sunset. Still, many longtime residents quietly agree on one thing: some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. In late September of 2019, 41-year-old environmental consultant Rebecca Morgan traveled from Charleston to survey water quality near an abandoned mining watershed outside Fayette County. Her company specialized in restoring streams damaged by decades of coal production, and Rebecca had spent nearly 15 years working in remote sections of Appalachia without a single serious incident. Colleagues described her as careful, experienced, and unwilling to take unnecessary risks. Every survey followed the same routine: arrive before sunrise, complete inspections before evening, and avoid overnight work whenever possible. That schedule changed after unexpected equipment failures delayed the project until late afternoon. Rebecca considered spending the night in a nearby motel, but weather forecasts predicted heavy rain beginning before dawn. Waiting until morning would force another full day of delays and additional travel costs. Shortly after 6:30, she packed her equipment and began driving toward the final monitoring station located near an abandoned mining settlement known decades earlier as Red Hollow. The community had once housed more than 300 families before the last coal operation closed during the mid-1980s. Today, almost nothing remained except broken foundations, scattered utility poles, and a weathered church standing alone beside the road. Before leaving the county maintenance office, Rebecca mentioned her destination to an older road supervisor named Carl Jenkins. Carl had lived in Fayette County his entire life and recognized Red Hollow immediately. Instead of discussing road conditions, he asked Rebecca what time she expected to finish. When she answered that she hoped to leave shortly after sunset, Carl became unusually serious. He quietly suggested postponing the inspection until morning. Rebecca assumed the warning related to rough terrain or wildlife activity. Carl simply shook his head and replied, "The road is fine. It's what people keep reporting after dark that worries me." Before Rebecca could ask another question, another employee interrupted the conversation, and the subject was never mentioned again. The drive toward Red Hollow followed a narrow 2-lane road climbing steadily into the surrounding mountains. Cell phone reception disappeared almost immediately after she left the highway. Thick hardwood forests blocked nearly every view beyond the next curve, while abandoned rail lines occasionally appeared beside the pavement before vanishing beneath overgrown vegetation. Rebecca had driven similar roads countless times and noticed nothing unusual during the first hour except how completely empty they seemed. She passed only 3 vehicles, all heading toward town. None traveled in the opposite direction after sunset. At exactly 8:14, according to the timestamp later recovered from her dashboard camera, Rebecca rounded a curve and noticed an old church standing beside the road. Its white paint had almost completely faded away, leaving weathered wooden walls barely visible beneath moonlight. One upstairs window glowed faintly as though someone had left a single lamp burning inside. Rebecca slowed briefly, surprised that anyone still maintained the building after so many years. She continued another mile before reaching the creek crossing marked on her survey map. When she checked the GPS coordinates, they did not match the location recorded by her company. Somehow, she remained nearly 3 miles from the monitoring station despite following the only road available. Assuming she had entered incorrect coordinates, Rebecca turned around. Less than 10 minutes later, she passed the same church again. This time, the front entrance stood partially open. No vehicles occupied the gravel parking lot, no lights shone from nearby homes. The glowing upstairs window remained exactly as before. Rebecca glanced at the dashboard clock and noticed only 4 minutes had passed since she first saw the building. The distance between the church and the creek crossing should have required nearly 10 minutes at her average speed. She stopped briefly on the shoulder, restarted her navigation system, and confirmed the route had not changed. As she continued driving, the road became strangely familiar. Every sharp bend, fallen tree, and damaged guardrail appeared exactly where she remembered seeing them only moments earlier. Then she noticed something even more unsettling. Fresh tire tracks covered the dusty shoulder ahead before ending abruptly beside an abandoned bus stop. There were no tracks leading away. Rebecca stepped out with a flashlight, expecting to find another vehicle hidden among the trees. The forest remained completely silent. Even the usual sounds of insects seemed to disappear. Moments later, her handheld radio emitted several seconds of heavy static before a calm male voice quietly said, "You're going the wrong way." The transmission ended before she could respond. Company records later confirmed nobody else was using that frequency within 50 miles. Rebecca returned to her truck and continued toward the monitoring station without stopping again. Nearly 15 minutes later, she finally reached the location marked on her survey documents. The water sampling equipment remained exactly where technicians had installed it months earlier. She completed the inspection in less than 20 minutes before beginning the return drive. To her surprise, the church had disappeared entirely. The road where it should have stood contained only an empty clearing surrounded by broken stone foundations. State historical records later confirmed a church had once existed there, but burned to the ground during 1993 after being struck by lightning. No rebuilding permits were ever issued. The following week, Rebecca casually described the experience while submitting her field report. Instead of dismissing the story, another environmental consultant admitted witnessing something similar nearly 8 years earlier. Curious, the company's safety manager searched archived incident logs and discovered 3 unrelated employees had reported navigation problems near Red Hollow after sunset over the previous 2 decades. None mentioned ghosts or paranormal activity, all described passing landmarks that later proved no longer existed. The company quietly updated its internal safety guidelines soon afterward. From that point forward, environmental surveys near abandoned mining communities in southern West Virginia would end before sunset whenever possible. The policy cited reduced visibility and remote terrain as the official reasons. Unofficially, several longtime employees believed the change came after too many experienced field workers returned, describing roads that somehow led through places history had already erased. To this day, local deputies continue responding to occasional calls from travelers, reporting strange navigation errors, missing stretches of time, or abandoned buildings appearing where official maps show nothing at all. None of the reports have produced evidence proving anything extraordinary occurred. Investigators continue attributing most incidents to fatigue, unfamiliar roads, or poor nighttime visibility. Yet among the people who have spent their entire lives in the mountains, one piece of advice survives generation after generation. If darkness falls while driving through the forgotten roads of southern West Virginia, and you suddenly recognize a place that should no longer exist, keep driving. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. Strange things happened on our June road trip after midnight. Deep in the remote stretches of the Texas Hill Country, a routine nocturnal drive became a completely unexplainable, terrifying nightmare. During the incredibly humid summer of 2022, young travelers encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What regional law enforcement eventually uncovered, entirely, completely destroyed, the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific rural desert community forever. Archive notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunts state police today. 28-year-old David Miller worked as a dedicated corporate accountant, simply trying to relocate his small family safely. His capable traveling partner was a 26-year-old freelance photographer named Lisa, who actively documented rural historical landscapes. Their primary summer objective required them to drive safely across the desolate Texas wilderness, far away from heavily congested interstates. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unstable, dangerous sinkholes forming throughout that exact rural region. They arrived on June 14th and immediately began carefully plotting their specific nocturnal driving route near a dark limestone canyon. The first quiet, extremely hot evening passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted travelers drove steadily onward. State records confirm that severe, scattered desert thunderstorms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Lisa woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy scraping sounds echoing near the steep, dusty ridge. She initially assumed a curious, heavy desert animal was aggressively investigating their suddenly stalling vehicle near the rocky, jagged roadside. When she cautiously looked directly outside, the heavy metallic scraping sounds instantly ceased in the hot, oppressive summer nocturnal darkness. David quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive deep indentations in the dusty soil the following heavily foggy morning. The strange, unexplainable deep tracks were perfectly circular in shape, and they sank nearly 5 inches into the solid dirt. Some locals claimed a rogue commercial mining outfit operated illegally nearby, but investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors. David carefully photographed the bizarre, dusty, massive footprints and noted that the stride length indicated a massive, heavy industrial machine. He calmly, rationally theorized that some unknown automated logging equipment might have dangerously crossed their remote territory completely unexpectedly overnight. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark night when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. Both dedicated travelers immediately started coughing violently and aggressively, struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed heavy vehicle cabin. Lisa quickly grabbed her portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional ranger station during that month. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid asphalt ground and partially cracked their rigid windshield frame. David scrambled frantically out the dark open door and desperately aimed his high-powered thermal imaging camera directly pointing upward. The glowing digital screen instantly revealed an enormous, intense heat signature standing perfectly still behind a large dead oak tree. The strange glowing thermal image lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient background radiation thermal signatures. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing bright anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Morning light quickly, clearly revealed that their specialized digital navigation equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless, broken, jagged pieces. David frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to abandon their remaining travel gear and hike toward the main rural highway. Lisa completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized their backup analog compasses were constantly displaying completely erratic, unexplainable magnetic headings. They were effectively hopelessly, completely lost in a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced, rugged survivalists. The desperate, anxious travelers decided to blindly, consistently follow the slow, dusty trail, hoping it safely intersected a paved road. They hiked for 12 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched closely behind. Archived notes from Lisa stated she repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly, entirely nearby. Every single time she abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes instantly, completely vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced them to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected makeshift camp by the car. They huddled tightly, safely together by a small, warm fire while strongly clutching their sturdy walking sticks for necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense desert suddenly fell totally dead silent as wild insects stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath their heavy boots. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Texas region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. David frantically aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his thermal camera, but the expensive digital battery exploded. Lisa screamed out loudly in absolute sheer unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped into the firelight. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly aggressively attack them, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly directly ahead. David slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange flare gun, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly extinguished the warm, bright campfire flames. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness, the two terrified close friends blindly, frantically ran into the treacherous, thorny desert. They hopelessly, blindly sprinted continuously through the dense, tangled brush until they eventually physically separated from each other completely forever. A commercial desert survey operator miraculously, happily found Lisa wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel public access channel. The young, traumatized photographer was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by sharp, jagged cactuses. State records confirm she was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly chemically treated properly. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned vehicle, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel car doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. David was tragically completely never seen again, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional search effort spanning 3 adjacent dry counties. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely entirely lost his distinct individual scent trail near the steep edge of rocky cliffs. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing accountant accidentally fatally fell into the massive, dark, hidden sinkhole. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy vehicle equipment was completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally, officially unsolved. Lisa completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising freelance rural photography career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, crowded city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark desert experiences. She eventually quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark Texas hill country deserts remain mostly completely, thoroughly uncharted and deeply, heavily feared by many veteran guides. Experienced local rural tour operators actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice tourists from widely exploring that specific area. Official public-state records conflict regarding the actual total highly accurate number of missing persons cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously completely venture into the dark region, hoping to finally capture definitive evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Lisa. The destroyed, shattered digital thermal camera conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant heat signature. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archive notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet, the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown massive desert animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying Texas desert case. The completely destroyed vehicle remains permanently locked securely inside a heavily guarded regional police evidence facility building completely indefinitely today. The thick steel chassis is completely severely warped and violently twisted in ways that heavily confuse professional, licensed structural engineers. They absolutely cannot logically, mathematically explain the immense localized heat signatures required to permanently warp such durable, thick commercial steel. The strange chemical residue carefully extracted from the melted doors completely lacks any known, recognizable, earthly, scientific, periodic table components. Law enforcement officials strongly, silently, actively discourage any independent laboratory scientists from officially testing the highly unusual toxic chemical samples. The specific isolated stretch of rural, unmarked desert highway remains completely officially closed to all civilian commercial traffic passing today. Heavy concrete barricades severely, completely restrict access to the dusty, dark path where the terrified couple originally became lost. Dispatch logs occasionally record highly unusual frantic phone calls from nearby rural ranchers complaining about strange bright nightly skylights. The massive glowing orbs reportedly silently hover directly above the completely restricted desert area before rapidly shooting straight vertically upward. Investigators never confirmed these extremely bizarre, localized aerial phenomena and simply quickly dismissed them as common military night training flares. Lisa constantly refuses to leave her highly secure concrete urban apartment whenever the hot summer season slowly, inevitably descends annually. She strictly, violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely, completely fastened throughout the entire long, dark night. She passionately, completely believes the towering, pale entities are still aggressively, constantly searching for her across the vast, expansive country. Her intense, ongoing, severe psychological therapy sessions carefully attempt to slowly, rationally dismantle her deeply ingrained, absolute paranoid mental delusions, the actual, absolute, terrifying truth hiding deep within that desolate Texas desert wilderness might never be completely, fully mathematically understood. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely safely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered. The county file from 2009 explicitly severely warns travelers to completely avoid driving completely alone during dark nights. State records clearly, consistently, actively document a highly disturbing pattern of unexplainable, strange disappearances occurring specifically during extremely hot Junes. The highly dedicated professional regional search teams completely, entirely refuse to officially patrol that specific dark sector after sunset arrives. What people continually reported seeing out there in the massive dark desert still completely, definitively, genuinely makes absolute zero sense. The completely bizarre, tragic Texas desert incident remains a highly popular, terrifying discussion topic on obscure internet online mystery forums. Amateur online sleuths constantly aggressively debate the various conflicting official reports while desperately searching for any hidden, logical, factual clues. Some highly dedicated researchers actively cross-reference these strange coordinate locations with deeply buried historical, indigenous, regional dark folklore stories. They firmly, completely believe the ancient native tribes genuinely knew exactly what terrifying entities lurked inside those specific dark canyons. However, local authorities absolutely strictly prohibit anyone from actively organizing dangerous, large-scale civilian search parties within that restricted region. The quiet, peaceful illusion of a totally harmless, relaxing summer road trip was completely, permanently shattered for that young family. Lisa completely isolated herself from all her remaining worried friends and slowly became a highly reclusive, paranoid urban apartment hermit. She constantly, frequently stares blankly out her heavily locked, reinforced apartment window while quietly listening for any heavy mechanical vibrations. Her completely tragic, deeply terrifying story serves as a highly dark, severe warning for any overly adventurous, naive young travelers. The absolute darkest, unseen, deepest corners of the harsh, remote American environment heavily conceal truly dangerous, unexplainable, ancient, predatory anomalies. In this news story, most visitors entered Appalachia expecting breathtaking overlooks, quiet rivers, and endless forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. They planned scenic drives through mountain passes where every curve revealed another postcard view. Few realized those same roads carried generations of stories that never appeared in travel brochures. Long before highways connected distant towns, narrow mountain routes linked isolated communities that depended entirely on one another, families remembered every bridge, every abandoned church, and every forgotten cemetery hidden among the ridges. Some roads eventually gained quiet reputations that locals rarely discussed with strangers. The warnings usually arrived as simple advice rather than dramatic ghost stories. Older residents suggested reaching the next town before sunset or choosing the longer highway instead of certain backroads. They almost never explained why. For most travelers, those conversations sounded like ordinary mountain folklore. Only years later did some realize they had unknowingly driven through places where unexplained experiences had been reported for generations. One autumn evening, the Harris family began what they believed would become another unforgettable drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark Harris enjoyed photographing abandoned structures, while his wife Jennifer preferred documenting forgotten churches, one-room schoolhouses, and historic cemeteries scattered throughout rural valleys. Their teenage son Ethan spent most trips recording video for a travel channel dedicated to overlooked destinations across America. They had already crossed thousands of miles without experiencing anything stranger than unexpected wildlife crossing the road. Careful planning, reliable equipment, and years of experience convinced them they understood mountain travel better than most tourists. Nothing suggested this journey would become the only trip they refused to repeat. Their route followed a collection of state highways winding through remote sections of eastern Appalachia, where towns sometimes stood nearly 40 miles apart. Cellular reception faded shortly after leaving the interstate. Paper maps replaced navigation apps because the surrounding mountains frequently interrupted satellite signals. The family welcomed the isolation. Modern distractions disappeared almost immediately, leaving only forests stretching endlessly beyond both sides of the pavement. Occasional wooden signs pointed toward communities with populations smaller than a single city block elsewhere in the country. Weather remained perfect throughout the afternoon. Blue skies reflected across narrow rivers flowing beside the highway, while cool mountain air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Shortly before sunset, they stopped at a family-owned diner overlooking a small valley. Local residents filled nearly every table despite the quiet weekday evening. Conversations centered around hunting season, changing weather, and roads damaged during previous winters. When Mark casually mentioned their planned route across an older mountain highway, several conversations briefly stopped before continuing as though nothing had happened. Their waitress hesitated only long enough to ask whether they intended driving that road after dark. Mark answered yes, because the next motel remained less than 90 miles away. She nodded politely before recommending they leave immediately rather than waiting for dessert. Her tone carried concern instead of fear, making the advice strangely memorable. The highway narrowed within minutes after leaving town. Fresh pavement gradually gave way to older asphalt, patched repeatedly over decades. Guardrails disappeared along several steep curves overlooking valleys that vanished beneath growing darkness. Dense hardwood forests pressed tightly against both sides of the road until branches formed a tunnel overhead. Traffic became almost non-existent. During nearly 40 minutes, they encountered only one pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. Its driver briefly flashed headlights twice before disappearing around the next bend. Jennifer assumed the signal warned about deer farther ahead. Ethan continued filming through the windshield, hoping to capture the fading evening light filtering between towering ridges. Darkness arrived much faster than expected beneath the forest canopy. Mark switched to high beams, revealing countless tree trunks standing like silent walls only a few feet beyond the pavement. Fog slowly gathered inside low valleys before drifting upward across the highway. Visibility remained acceptable, yet every curve looked strangely similar to the previous one. Ethan eventually lowered his camera after noticing something unusual. Mile markers seemed inconsistent. Marker 63 appeared first, followed several minutes later by marker 61. Another curve revealed marker 64 again. Mark assumed he had simply misread them while concentrating on the winding road. Ethan replayed his recording and quietly confirmed the numbers appeared exactly as remembered. Jennifer unfolded their paper map beneath the interior light. According to the route, they should have reached a small crossroads community nearly 15 minutes earlier. Instead, the forest continued uninterrupted in every direction. No driveways appeared, no mailboxes stood beside the pavement, even electrical lines seemed to vanish beyond the last ridge they crossed. The silence outside gradually became noticeable. Normally, mountain roads echoed with insects, distant streams, or occasional owls. Here, the surrounding forest appeared completely still, despite gentle wind moving across the higher slopes. When Mark lowered his window for several seconds, he heard nothing except the steady hum of the engine. Another 20 minutes passed before headlights illuminated an old white church standing beside the road. A narrow cemetery surrounded the building behind a weathered iron fence leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Jennifer asked whether they could stop for photographs the following morning because moonlight gave the place an unusual appearance. Mark slowed slightly but continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up from his camera and quietly asked why they were passing the same church again. Nobody answered immediately. The identical leaning fence, cracked front steps, and broken stained glass window stood exactly where they had appeared before. Mark insisted another church probably resembled the first one because many rural congregations used nearly identical architecture. Ethan remained unconvinced after comparing both video clips side by side. The family finally reached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. Beside the entrance stood an old wooden warning sign faded almost beyond recognition. Jennifer noticed a distinctive lightning-shaped crack running through one corner of the board. 15 minutes later, another bridge appeared. The same crack marked another weathered sign, standing in exactly the same position. Ethan searched his earlier footage again before quietly showing the screen to his parents. Every knot in the wood matched perfectly. Even missing paint formed identical patterns. Mark felt the first genuine wave of uncertainty since entering the mountains. He checked the odometer. According to the vehicle, they had traveled nearly 60 additional miles, yet every landmark suggested otherwise. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. Mark attempted turning onto the first side road they encountered, hoping it would reconnect with another highway. Less than 5 minutes later, the narrow lane curved unexpectedly before returning to the same main road from the opposite direction. The old bridge stood ahead once again. Jennifer suggested consulting a compass stored inside the glove compartment. The needle refused to settle in one direction, drifting slowly before stopping, then turning again without obvious reason. Ethan tried restarting his phone, even though no signal remained available. The digital map loaded briefly before displaying their location several counties away, then disappeared completely. None of the devices agreed with one another. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle finally appeared behind them. Relief spread through the family until Jennifer noticed something unsettling. The headlights never seemed to grow closer, despite following for nearly 15 minutes. They remained the same distance back through every curve, occasionally disappearing behind hills before returning exactly where they had been before. Mark reduced speed, hoping the driver would pass. The lights slowed as well. He accelerated slightly. They matched his pace again without gaining or falling farther behind. Ethan filmed through the rear window until the headlights vanished completely while rounding one sharp bend. The road behind them remained empty for miles afterward. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small gas station illuminated by a single fluorescent light. Relief quickly turned into confusion after discovering the pumps covered with rust and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Dust coated every window. The building had obviously been abandoned for years. Jennifer later recalled feeling certain she had seen the lights glowing from nearly a mile away, yet no electrical service appeared connected anywhere on the property. Ethan photographed the station before they continued driving. The digital timestamps on every image later showed conflicting times despite being taken only seconds apart. Some indicated photographs captured before they entered the highway, while others appeared almost 2 hours into the future. No explanation ever accounted for the corrupted sequence. The highway finally emerged from the mountains shortly before dawn. A larger state road appeared ahead, along with the first passing traffic they had seen in hours. They stopped at a convenience store where the cashier immediately asked whether they had spent the night on the old mountain route. Without describing their experience, Mark simply nodded. The cashier quietly explained that travelers occasionally arrived exhausted after believing they had driven in circles despite following the same highway. Most blamed heavy fog, unfamiliar terrain, or fatigue. Others refused discussing the experience altogether. Local law enforcement had investigated numerous reports over the years, yet found no damaged signs, missing intersections, or roadway defects capable of explaining why unrelated visitors described remarkably similar experiences separated by decades. Back home, the Harris family reviewed every photograph, map, and video collected during the trip. Mileage records, timestamps, and recorded landmarks refused to fit into any logical sequence. Nothing proved anything supernatural had occurred. Mountain roads, exhaustion, changing weather, and human perception could easily combine in unexpected ways. Researchers studying navigation errors have long documented how isolated environments distort distance, direction, and memory, especially after dark. Even so, one detail remained impossible for the family to ignore. Ethan's continuous dashboard recording showed the same weathered church appearing twice without any visible turnaround, intersection, or break in the journey. Every attempt to retrace the route months later failed because neither the church nor the abandoned gas station could be located where maps indicated they should have been. Today, the family still visits Appalachia, but they never travel unfamiliar mountain roads after sunset. Whenever someone asks why, they simply recommend reaching the next town before dark, repeating the same quiet advice once offered to them without explanation. In this new story, terrifying true encounters from the deep Appalachian Mountains. In 2013, 24-year-old park ranger Elias Thorne was stationed in a remote sector of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. His primary objective involved surveying trail erosion following a series of heavy storms that had compromised the structural integrity of the local ridgelines. Thorne was an experienced outdoorsman who possessed a deep understanding of the regional topography and the inherent risks associated with isolated mountain navigation. Reportedly, he had completed hundreds of similar solo patrols without incident during his 3-year tenure with the Forestry Department. However, county files from 2013 indicate that his final scheduled check-in never reached the regional dispatch center that evening. The initial search efforts commenced within 6 hours of the missed radio contact as local authorities followed the documented route left in the official logs. State records indicate that search parties found Thorne's abandoned utility vehicle parked at a designated trailhead with his personal gear still inside the cabin. Some investigators noted that the driver's side door remained wide open despite the approaching cold front and the significant drop in ambient temperature. Archived notes from the primary search coordinator describe a scene where there were no signs of a struggle or any forced entry. Dispatch logs from that night confirm that a heavy fog rolled through the valley, which significantly hindered the visibility for the ground teams. By the morning of the second day, a group of local volunteers claimed they discovered a series of unusual depressions in the soft mud. Investigators never confirmed if these markings were of human origin or simply the result of natural erosion occurring near the creek bed. State records show that the tracks led toward a steep limestone cavern system that was not marked on any of the modern geological maps. According to several archived notes from the period, the cave entrance appeared to have been recently disturbed by something of significant physical mass. The team found a single torn piece of a standard forestry uniform snagged on a sharp rock fragment deep within the dark passage. A secondary forensic team arrived on site to examine the evidence, but they found that the subterranean environment was too unstable for a full descent. Records conflict regarding the exact depth of the shaft and whether the sounds reported by the volunteers were echoes or something more tangible. Some locals claimed they heard a rhythmic metallic scraping emanating from the limestone depths during the quiet hours of the early morning search. County files from 2013 reflect that no animal known to the region would produce a sound matching the descriptions provided by those witnesses. The official investigation eventually stalled due to the lack of physical remains and the increasingly hazardous conditions inside the crumbling cavern system. As the weeks passed into 2014, search teams expanded their radius to include the higher elevation ridges located several miles from the vehicle. Records from the county sheriff department indicate that a second-person 29-year-old surveyor named Sarah Miller also went missing nearby. Miller was reportedly working on a private land assessment project when her equipment was found neatly stacked on a granite boulder. State records show that her GPS unit had been placed on top of the stack and was still powered on when found. Investigators never confirmed why she would abandon her high-value tools in the middle of a shift during broad daylight. Archive notes from the Miller case file describe a series of inconsistent witness accounts regarding her movements on the day she vanished. Some locals claimed they saw a figure matching her description walking toward the high peaks without any of her necessary safety gear. Dispatch logs from that afternoon do not record any distress signals or calls for assistance from her assigned mobile radio unit. State records indicate that the search for Miller was eventually merged with the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne. Authorities noted that both individuals were last seen within a 5-mile radius of the same unmapped limestone cavern system. During the summer of 2014, a team of specialized cave divers attempted to explore the flooded lower chambers of the mountain range. County files from 2014 suggest that the divers discovered a series of narrow tunnels that showed evidence of human occupation. Archive notes describe the presence of several rusted tools and fragments of clothing that appeared to date back several decades. Investigators never confirmed if these items belonged to recent missing persons or to workers from an abandoned mining operation. Records conflict about whether the tunnel system connects to the surface at any point other than the main limestone entrance. One diver reportedly claimed that he saw a series of deliberate markings etched into the stone walls deep beneath the waterline. These markings appeared to be a set of dates and initials, but the silt levels made it impossible to capture clear images. State records show that the diving operation was terminated early after 2 members of the team experienced unexplained equipment malfunctions. Dispatch logs indicate that both divers reported a sudden and total loss of their primary lighting systems simultaneously while in separate chambers. No technical reason for the double failure was ever identified by the equipment manufacturers during the subsequent forensic review. 14 months later, a pair of hikers in a neighboring county located a rusted handheld radio resting on a high rocky ledge. State records verify that the serial number on the device matched the unit issued to Thorne before his disappearance. The ledge was located over 12 miles away from the original search area and required a level of climbing skill Thorne did not possess. Investigators found that the battery had been removed and the internal components were completely corroded by long-term exposure. There was no explanation for how the device reached such a remote and inaccessible location without the use of specialized gear is less than hash. Zero hash is greater than. Historical data from the county archives mentions a similar series of unexplained disappearances that occurred in the same region in 1976. State records from that era describe a group of 4 experienced backpackers who vanished while navigating the Monongahela forest ridgelines. According to archive notes, the only evidence found was a single tent that had been sliced open from the inside. Investigators never confirmed if the cuts were made by a tool or by the jagged rocks surrounding the campsite. Some locals claimed that the hikers had wandered into an area known for magnetic anomalies that interfere with compass readings. Dispatch logs from 1976 indicate that search teams were forced to retreat due to a sudden and uncharacteristic seismic event. State records show that the ground tremors caused significant shifts in the local cave systems, which altered the landscape permanently. Archived notes from the time suggest that several previously known entrances were swallowed by the shifting limestone plates during the event. Investigators never confirmed if the missing backpackers were trapped in the lower chambers when the geological shift occurred. The files were eventually closed due to a lack of physical evidence or credible leads regarding their final coordinates. In 2015, a local rancher reported finding an old leather satchel partially buried in a dry creek bed near the mountain base. State records indicate that the satchel contained a set of handwritten journals belonging to an unknown individual from 2012. Archived notes from the forensic examination described the entries as a series of meticulous observations regarding the movement of local wildlife. One specific entry reportedly mentions a large bipedal figure that the author observed watching the camp from the tree line. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the journal author or why the satchel was abandoned in such a precarious spot. The journals also contained a hand-drawn map of the limestone cavern system that featured several exits not found on modern maps. State records show that one of these exits was located near the ledge where Thorne's radio was discovered later. Some investigators questioned if a hidden network of tunnels allowed for rapid movement across the difficult mountain terrain without being detected. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that a brief follow-up search was conducted based on the coordinates in the journal. However, the teams found that the specific area mentioned had been covered by a massive rockfall following the 2013 storms. County files from 2016 detail a report of strange light patterns observed by commercial pilots flying over the Monongahela region. State records indicate that the lights appeared as a series of blue pulses originating from the deep mountain valleys. Investigators never confirmed the source of the illumination, although some suggested it was atmospheric phenomena common to high altitudes. Archived notes from the federal aviation logs show that the pulses did not correspond to any known ground-based signals. These reports coincided with another brief spike in local missing person cases that occurred during the same calendar month. The case of Elias Thorne and Sarah Miller remains open in the state records, although no new leads have surfaced recently. Dispatch logs from the original search are still categorized as incomplete because of the numerous reports that were never officially verified. Some locals claimed that the mountain terrain itself changes during heavy fog, making it nearly impossible for even experienced rangers to navigate. Archived notes from the lead investigator suggest that Thorne might have simply succumbed to the elements after becoming disoriented. However, the lack of a body and the strange placement of his equipment continue to fuel a sense of uncertainty. What happened in this Appalachian ghost town still terrifies locals today. A freezing rain began to fall over the remote coal valley of Cinder Creek on the 9th night of October 1982. Local dispatch logs later showed that 3 separate emergency calls were placed from the mountain community within a 10-minute window. Each caller reported hearing a low and rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to vibrate directly through their living room floors. State records from that weekend indicated that the state police sent 2 troopers to investigate the unusual disturbance. When the officers arrived at the valley entrance, they found a deserted highway and a town that was completely dark. The local authorities never found a definitive explanation for why an entire community abandoned their homes in a single hour. Gideon Vance was a 38-year-old timber cruiser who spent his days assessing hardwood forests in Western Virginia. He had lived near the mouth of Cinder Creek his entire life and knew the steep mountain paths by heart. On that particular dreary morning, his only goal was to evaluate a dense stand of white oak near the ridgeline. He packed his iron marking axe and a worn leather field journal into the cab of his four-wheel drive truck. The morning air smelled strongly of wet coal dust and decaying leaves as he started his slow ascent up the mountain. He expected a routine day of measuring trunk diameters and noting boundary markers through the heavy mountain mist. By 4 in the afternoon, a dense and suffocating fog began to roll through the deep gaps in the mountain ridge. Gideon noticed that his pocket watch had stopped ticking entirely, which was highly unusual for a reliable mechanical timepiece. He packed his gear early and decided to walk back down toward the settlement before the mountain trail became treacherous. As he emerged from the tree line above the valley, he noticed that the entire town was shrouded in complete darkness. The streetlights were completely dead, and not a single window showed the warm glow of a lamp or a television screen. He quickened his pace down the gravel road to check on his neighbors at the local store. Gideon parked his truck outside the Cinder Creek General Store and walked up the creaking wooden steps to the front door. The air was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the steady dripping of rain from the rusted tin roof drainage. He pushed the door open and found the interior completely undisturbed, with the cash register drawer still closed tightly. A pot of fresh coffee was sitting on the cold burner, and several open ledgers were scattered across the counter. He shouted into the back storage room, but his voice only produced a faint echo against the unpainted wooden walls. He noticed that every single house along the main road had its front door swung wide open to the storm. County files from 1982 later revealed that the state troopers found 24 vehicles left parked in their driveways. Gideon walked into the small valley schoolhouse and discovered that the children had left their woolen coats hanging on the wall. A charcoal chalkboard in the main classroom still displayed a spelling lesson that was dated for that exact Monday morning. He discovered several domestic pets wandering aimlessly through the muddy alleys, but there was no sign of their owners anywhere. The entire settlement felt like an open grave where a vibrant community had suddenly vanished without a single cry. He drove to the neighboring county seat to report the massive and inexplicable abandonment to the state authorities. He spent the next 4 days working alongside state investigators who arrived to secure the eerie and silent perimeter. Gideon used his intimate knowledge of the timber tracks to help the search teams systematically comb the surrounding mountain ridges. They found no signs of violence, no broken windows, and absolutely no footprints leading into the dense laurel thickets. Witness statements from a nearby logging camp indicated that no vehicles had passed through the valley road since the previous evening. A state police investigator named Silas Vance found a bizarre detail inside the abandoned rail depot at the edge of town. Some locals from the next valley claimed that the ground had been trembling for days before the disappearance. Silas discovered a series of deep fractures in the earth that ran directly parallel to the old iron railroad tracks. Gideon helped the investigator measure the deep fissures, which emitted a faint and bitter odor that smelled like sulfur. They found dozens of abandoned flashlights and heavy miner helmets scattered around the entrance of an old ventilation shaft. The tracks inside the shaft led deep into abandoned coal workings that ran directly beneath the residential section of the town. Mining archives showed these particular tunnels had been closed down by the federal government back in 1965. Investigators never confirmed whether an illegal salvage operation had been active inside the dangerous and unmapped subterranean passages. The investigators recovered a waterlogged leather notebook from a metal locker inside the foreman office at the depot. Archived notes from a retired rail supervisor indicated that a massive underground pocket of methane gas had been expanding for months. The final handwritten entry described a sudden shift in the mountain bedrock that threatened to collapse the entire valley floor. The supervisor wrote that the air quality had dropped below safe levels and made an immediate evacuation absolutely necessary. They apparently fled into the deep mountain tunnels to escape the toxic fumes because the highway was blocked by a rock slide. Records conflict regarding whether the residents ever emerged from the complex network of interconnected cavern systems on the other side. The state authorities ultimately classified the valley as a permanent hazard zone and restricted all public entry with high fences. Gideon stood on the ridge months later and watched heavy machinery dump tons of gravel into the main valley entrance. The empty houses of Cinder Creek remained standing as rotting skeletons of a town that was swallowed by the mountain. Investigators closed the official file, but the true location of the residents remains a dark mystery among the regional population. The silent and overgrown valley is the only remaining reminder of the night an entire Appalachian community vanished into thin air. The Whispering Ridges of Blackwood Canyon. The eastern slopes of the mountain range remained largely unmapped during the late 19th century, attracting only the most resilient timber cruisers and surveyors. In the autumn of roughly 80 years ago, a team of 4 experienced land surveyors established a base camp in a deep, heavily forested valley known locally as Blackwood Canyon. Their objective was to plot the boundaries of a proposed timber reserve, a task requiring them to spend several weeks in total isolation from the nearest settlement. The environment was characterized by dense stands of old-growth Douglas fir, steep rocky terrain, and a silence so profound that the men initially remarked on the complete absence of typical forest sounds. By the 4th day of the expedition, the routine nature of their work began to shift, as a series of unexplained auditory sensations disrupted the camp. The men reported hearing what sounded like distant, rhythmic chanting that seemed to emanate directly from the stone walls of the canyon rather than from any distinct physical source. The lead surveyor, a veteran of wilderness campaigns named Thomas Albright, noted in his logs that the sounds did not align with any known wildlife or geological activity. The noises typically began just after sundown, starting as a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the ground before transitioning into distinct, modulated cadences resembling human speech. When the crew attempted to trace the sound, they found that its apparent direction shifted constantly, making it impossible to pinpoint an origin point. The younger members of the crew, including a transit operator named Edward Lynn, expressed growing discomfort, describing a sensation of intense pressure in their ears whenever the chanting commenced. Despite their unease, the team maintained their daily schedule, attributing the phenomenon to unusual wind currents passing through the narrow rock formations higher up the ridge. However, the lack of any significant wind during those chilly, still autumn nights quickly complicated that rationalization. As the first week drew to a close, the auditory disturbances escalated from distant hums to loud, distinct vocalizations that appeared to occur much closer to the perimeter of their camp. On the night of October 12th, all 4 men awoke simultaneously to the sound of a single, sustained note that seemed to vibrate the very canvas of their tents. Albright exited his tent with a lantern, but found nothing in the surrounding woods, except for a peculiar, localized mist that hung low to the ground despite a clear sky overhead. The camp dog, a large retriever known for its reliable tracking instincts, refused to leave the shelter of the supply wagon and spent the remaining hours of the night whimpering. The next morning, the crew discovered that their brass surveying instruments, which had been securely locked in wooden cases, were completely out of alignment, their delicate internal needles pointing wildly away from magnetic north. The psychological toll of the continuous, unexplained noise began to manifest in the behavior of the crew members, who reported experiencing vivid, recurring dreams of vast subterranean spaces. Lynn, in particular, became increasingly obsessed with the idea that the sounds were a form of communication, spending his evening hours sitting at the edge of the firelight, listening intently to the darkness. His journals from that week contained frantic attempts to transcribe the phonetic patterns of the chanting, resulting in pages of repetitive, nonsensical symbols that bore no resemblance to any known language. The other men attempted to dissuade him from his isolation, but a growing sense of irritability and mutual suspicion began to fracture the group dynamic. The shared perception of an unseen, listening presence in the valley created an atmosphere of pervasive dread that made sleep nearly impossible. By mid-October, the weather turned sharply colder, bringing heavy frost but no wind to explain the persistent acoustic phenomena. The team decided to accelerate their fieldwork in order to leave the canyon ahead of schedule, working longer hours in the rugged upper terrain. During these daytime excursions, the men began to experience sensory distortions, reporting that the forest appeared strangely flat and devoid of color, as if a thick veil had been drawn over the landscape. They also noted that their perception of time seemed heavily altered, with hours passing in what felt like mere moments, or conversely, a single afternoon stretching out into an agonizingly long ordeal. On several occasions, members of the party became momentarily separated in wide-open clearings, only to find themselves completely disoriented and unable to locate their companions who were standing less than 50 yards away. The peak incident occurred on the night of October 20th, during a period of total atmospheric stillness. The chanting, which had been absent during the day, returned with an unprecedented intensity that made conversation within the camp impossible without shouting. According to later accounts collected from the survivors, the sound did not seem to travel through the air, but rather originated from within their own skulls, creating an intense throbbing sensation behind their eyes. At approximately midnight, Lin abruptly stood up from his bed, walked past his companions without speaking, and strode directly into the unlit forest toward the steepest section of the canyon wall. Albright and the remaining crew grabbed lanterns and pursued him immediately, but the dense undergrowth and the overwhelming nature of the sound severely hindered their progress through the dark. They followed the sound of Lin crashing through the brush until they reached the base of a massive, sheer cliff face where the acoustic vibrations were so intense that the lantern glass began to shatter. Through the dim, flickering light of the remaining lanterns, the men observed Lin standing motionless against the rock, his head tilted back as if looking toward the summit. When Albright approached to pull him away, Lin turned around, exhibiting a state of profound shock, his eyes wide and completely unblinking. He insisted that the wall of rock was no longer solid, but rather a vast opening leading into a brightly lit space filled with moving figures. The other crew members saw only the solid gray expanse of limestone, but the discrepancy in their perceptions caused an immediate, panicked retreat back to the main camp. The following morning, the team abandoned the majority of their heavy equipment and began a rapid descent out of Blackwood Canyon, determined to reach the nearest logging outpost. Lin remained in a catatonic state during the entire trek, requiring physical assistance to walk and showing no awareness of his surroundings. The remaining 3 men were plagued by a persistent ringing in their ears and a deep physical exhaustion that did not subside even after they exited the valley. Upon reaching safety, the surveyors underwent medical evaluations where doctors noted that all 4 men exhibited symptoms typically associated with extreme prolonged exposure to low-frequency vibrations, including inner ear damage and severe cognitive disorientation. An official investigation into the incident was launched by the Regional Surveying Office, primarily to recover the expensive abandoned equipment and to verify the claims made by the crew. A secondary team of surveyors, accompanied by 2 local law enforcement officers, entered Blackwood Canyon 3 weeks after the original party had fled. They located the base camp intact, though they noted that the surrounding vegetation showed unusual signs of localized desiccation, with leaves and pine needles scorched as if subjected to intense heat, despite no evidence of an actual fire. The brass instruments were recovered from their boxes, but examiners later determined that their metal components had become permanently demagnetized, rendering them completely useless for future geographic work. The second expedition experienced none of the acoustic phenomena reported by Albright's crew, finding the valley to be entirely quiet and unremarkable. They concluded that the original team had likely suffered from a form of collective hysteria brought on by the extreme isolation, poor rations, and the deceptive echoes common to narrow, rocky canyons. This environmental explanation, however, failed to satisfy the men who had lived through the experience, particularly given the permanent physical changes they suffered. Lin never fully recovered his faculties and spent the remainder of his life in a private sanitarium, where he continued to insist, until his death, that a part of his mind had remained behind inside the stone walls of the ridge. The case of Blackwood Canyon was eventually archived in regional historical records as a curious footnote in the mapping of the territory, largely forgotten by the public. Modern researchers who have examined the surviving logs and medical reports suggest that the valley may possess unique geological features capable of producing infrasound, which can cause hallucinations, anxiety, and physiological distress in humans. Others point to the possibility of localized pocket emissions of natural gases that could distort perception and cause collective neurological symptoms. To this day, the exact nature of what the surveyors encountered in that isolated valley remains unresolved, leaving behind only the eerie, unsettling testimonies of the men who heard the ridge's whisper. The lingering questions surrounding the event continued to discourage further development in Blackwood Canyon for decades after the survey team's disastrous expedition. Local logging companies found that workers were highly reluctant to enter the valley, citing the old stories of the chanting and the psychological breakdown of the surveyors. Even when high-quality timber became scarce in adjacent areas, the canyon remained untouched, preserved by a reputation that time did not seem to dim. The few independent trappers who ventured near the perimeter of the valley in the early 20th century reported that the local wildlife appeared to avoid the deep interior of the canyon, preferring the more open, less oppressive terrain of the outer slopes. In the late 1950s, a university geology department attempted to conduct a comprehensive acoustic survey of the region to either confirm or disprove the infrasound hypothesis permanently. The researchers set up highly sensitive recording devices at various elevations along the canyon walls, hoping to capture any low-frequency vibrations generated by the unique rock formations. During their 2-week stay, the instruments recorded several instances of unusual seismic microtremors, but no significant acoustic anomalies were detected that matched the descriptions in Albright's journals. The study concluded that while the canyon's shape could theoretically amplify certain sounds, there was no contemporary evidence of any ongoing, unexplained phenomena active in the area. Despite the scientific community's skepticism, the private papers of Thomas Albright, which were donated to a regional historical society by his descendants, offer a much more personal and unsettling view of the aftermath. In his later years, Albright became a recluse, refusing to travel anywhere near mountainous terrain and keeping his home illuminated at all times of the night. His personal diaries reveal that he remained convinced until his final days that the phenomenon they encountered was not a product of the wind or gas, but something inherent to the location itself. He wrote extensively about the difficulty of adjusting to normal life when the memory of that absolute vibrating silence continued to echo in his mind, undermining his confidence in the physical world. The story of the Blackwood Canyon incident survives today primarily within the specialized archives of regional folklore and historical geography societies, away from mainstream media attention. It serves as a stark reminder of the limits of early exploration and the profound psychological effects that the deep wilderness can inflict on those who attempt to measure it. The unresolved discrepancy between the physical evidence of damaged equipment and the subjective horror experienced by the surveyors ensures that the valley retains its enigmatic status. Whether the events were caused by an undiscovered natural mechanism or a temporary distortion of human perception, the canyon remains a place where the boundary between reality and the unexplained became terrifyingly thin for 4 forgotten men. The Unmarked Road, hidden deep in Appalachia. Deep in the heavily forested Appalachian mountains of West Virginia, a lost driver experienced a completely unexplainable, terrifying event. During the bitter winter of 2020, a dedicated commercial trucker encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What local authorities eventually uncovered completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific dark rural mountain community forever. Archive notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunts state police today. 42-year-old Arthur Pendleton worked as a dedicated commercial transport driver, simply trying to finish his route. His isolated route forced him through a highly outdated rural mountainous region located miles away from any major modern interstates. His primary daily objective required him to safely deliver heavy industrial equipment completely alone during the long, dark winter nights. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual missing traveler cases originating from that exact region. Arthur arrived on November 12th and immediately began carefully navigating the icy, narrow roads while listening to the quiet radio. The first quiet, freezing hours passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents, as the exhausted driver cautiously navigated sharp turns. State records confirm that severe, scattered winter storms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Arthur stopped his massive truck shortly after midnight because he clearly saw a massive fallen tree blocking the highway. He initially assumed a severe winter windstorm had aggressively knocked the massive dead pine completely across the designated rural road. When he cautiously looked directly at his digital navigation map, he noticed a highly obscure, unmarked dirt bypass road nearby. Arthur aggressively turned his heavy commercial vehicle onto the unpaved path, hoping to safely bypass the massive, solid wooden obstruction. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic, mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. The isolated, terrified driver immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside the completely sealed truck cabin. Arthur quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional sheriff department during that night. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid dirt foundation and violently rattled the thick truck windows. Arthur scrambled frantically behind the heavy wooden steering wheel and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the trees. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the parked commercial delivery truck. The strange dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal bright ambient light from the moon. Records conflict regarding exactly how long he silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Arthur frantically, urgently insisted he absolutely needed to completely abandon the dangerous dirt road and aggressively reverse his heavy vehicle. He completely strongly pushed the heavy transmission lever, but he soon realized the main electrical engine panel was displaying sparks. He was effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced commercial delivery drivers. The desperate, anxious driver decided to blindly, violently run toward the back, hoping to retrieve his heavy defensive metal tools. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark dirt road until he eventually physically discovered massive, strange, deep tracks. Arthur remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid metal trailer while intensely listening for any sudden, aggressive movements. Archived notes from Arthur stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly near trees. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale shapes vanished. Utter physical mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position down low. He huddled tightly safely against the heavy metal tires while strongly clutching a heavy steel wrench for absolutely necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell totally dead silent as freezing winds stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath the rubber tires. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Appalachian region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. Arthur frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive digital battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped near the vehicle. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced metal, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly. Arthur slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel wrench tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling, extremely violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the thick truck windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness outside the truck, the terrified driver blindly, frantically crawled toward the deep brush. He hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, hidden, thorny bush until the early morning sunlight eventually safely arrived. A commercial timber delivery operator miraculously happily found the rural vehicle completely abandoned near the heavily designated gravel access channel. The highly traumatized young driver was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by broken glass. State records confirm he was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated for shock. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned truck, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel vehicle doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. Arthur was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional psychological support presence. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep edge of the woods. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing driver accidentally, entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive, deep, dark entity. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel doors were completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally, officially unsolved. Arthur completely, permanently, fully abandoned his promising commercial transport delivery plans and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, populated city. He completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding his terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark road experiences. He eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing his intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, he deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs routinely regularly show he frequently frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated, unmarked mountain road remains mostly completely thoroughly abandoned and deeply heavily feared by many local residents. Experienced local rural highway patrolmen actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice drivers from widely exploring that specific acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual total highly accurate number of missing traveler cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously completely venture into the dark, unmarked road, hoping to finally capture evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Arthur. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant outside entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archive notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown, massive humanoid animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large, hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply, safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying, unmarked road case. Arthur constantly refuses to leave his secure concrete urban apartment whenever the winter season finally slowly descends upon the city. He strictly, violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely fastened throughout the entire duration of the night. The actual, absolute, terrifying truth hiding deep within those ancient, desolate Appalachian mountains might never be completely, fully understood logically. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered forever. The new house seemed perfect until we heard someone upstairs. Deep within the historic suburban neighborhoods of Savannah, a young married couple purchased their beautiful colonial dream home. During the humid autumn of 2020, they completely renovated the massive historic wooden structure very carefully. What actually happened during their very first night indoors completely defies any basic, logical, modern, scientific explanation today. Archive notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of terrifying late-night events. 32-year-old Liam worked as a highly dedicated structural architect designing complex commercial office buildings daily. His highly capable wife was a 30-year-old financial accountant named Chloe, who frequently worked remotely indoors. Their primary professional goal required them to quickly establish a quiet, comfortable domestic life away from noisy apartments. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual trespassing complaints regarding this exact property. They officially arrived on October 12th and immediately began carefully unpacking their heavy cardboard boxes in the parlor. The first quiet afternoon passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted couple arranged their furniture. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and dropping temperatures for that entire dark night. However, Chloe woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy footsteps echoing above their ceiling. She initially assumed a large, heavy animal was aggressively exploring the completely unfinished, dusty, wooden, dark, hidden attic. When she cautiously listened closer, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps instantly ceased completely in the cold, oppressive, silent house. Liam quickly discovered a highly bizarre, locked, heavy wooden door blocking the narrow hallway leading toward the stairs. The strange, unexplainable heavy door was perfectly solid, and it featured 3 massive modern steel deadbolts installed backwards. Some locals claimed a rogue, eccentric previous owner actively hid dangerous structural damage behind heavily reinforced wooden barricades. Investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors and strictly maintained the property was entirely structurally safe generally. Liam carefully photographed the bizarre locked barricade and noted that the surrounding drywall showed extreme signs of stress. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. Both dedicated homeowners immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed bedroom. Liam quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional police department then. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and violently rattled the thick windows. Liam scrambled frantically toward the dark hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the stair banister. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal, bright ambient light entirely. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Chloe frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to completely abandon their newly purchased historic home and run outside. Liam completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized the main electrical breaker panel was constantly displaying erratic sparks. They were effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving structural maze known for permanently confusing, highly experienced contractors. The desperate, anxious architect decided to blindly, violently run toward the front door, hoping to retrieve his keys. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark living room until he eventually physically discovered the entrance. Liam remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid wooden couch while intensely listening for aggressive movements. Archived notes from Liam stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, they vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position. He huddled tightly, safely, against the heavy metal radiator while strongly clutching a heavy steel flashlight for protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense house suddenly fell totally dead silent entirely, completely. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath floorboards. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Savannah region, but geologists officially found nothing. Liam frantically aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant hallway with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced door, but simply stood motionless completely. Liam slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel flashlight tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the windows. Plunged into total suffocating pitch-black darkness inside the house, the terrified young couple blindly, frantically crawled desperately. They hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, locked basement room until the early morning sunlight arrived. A commercial utility repair operator miraculously happily found the rural property completely devastated near the heavily designated street. The highly traumatized young couple was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations from glass. State records confirm they were quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden interior doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal hinges twisted. Liam was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience despite the massive, highly coordinated psychological support. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep property edge. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing couple accidentally, entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive entity. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel locks were completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Chloe completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising financial accounting career and rapidly moved to a highly bustling city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable house experiences. She eventually, quietly, safely, wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs routinely, regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated suburban Savannah house remains mostly completely, thoroughly abandoned and deeply, heavily feared by residents. Experienced local rural real estate agents actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice buyers from exploring acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing trespasser cases strictly linked. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally, dangerously, completely venture into the dark, unmarked house hoping for evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with unsettling stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard, physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who believe. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily transformed. Archived notes, carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation, confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented leak, yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth melted door frames remains. University, biology, science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown anomaly. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive biological population of large hidden creatures leaves evidence. No unusual biological organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively positively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to protect operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying case. In this new story, true creepy and scary horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. In the autumn of 2021, a 24-year-old hiker named Elias Thorne, who worked as a land surveyor, entered the dense timber of the Monongahela National Forest for a weekend trek. He intended to document seasonal soil erosion patterns along the high ridges near the West Virginia border while testing new GPS equipment in deep terrain. Local dispatch logs from that evening indicate that the weather turned abruptly and a thick fog settled over the limestone valleys without any prior warning. Elias was a seasoned outdoorsman who understood the risks of the Appalachian landscape, but he reportedly failed to check in with his emergency contact. Investigators never confirmed if he strayed from the marked path or if the shifting weather conditions simply obscured the familiar landmarks of the trail. According to archive notes from the regional search team, Elias began to experience a series of equipment failures as he reached the higher elevations. The GPS unit displayed conflicting coordinates that suggested he was moving south, while his compass indicated a steady northern heading toward the primary base camp. He eventually decided to set up a temporary shelter near a rocky outcropping because the visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. State records indicate that several other hikers in the vicinity reported hearing repetitive metallic sounds echoing through the trees during the late hours of the night. Some locals claimed that the sounds were merely the result of wind moving through abandoned mining shafts, but the county file from 2009 suggests otherwise. Elias woke up during the early morning hours to find that his heavy hiking boots had been moved precisely 3 feet away from his tent. There were no footprints in the soft mud surrounding his campsite, and the internal zipper of his tent was still locked from the previous night. He gathered his belongings in total silence while observing that the surrounding forest had become unnaturally quiet, as if the local wildlife had fled. Records conflict regarding the exact path he took to exit the forest, but Elias later stated that he felt a constant presence just behind him. The investigation concluded without finding any evidence of another person in the area, and the case remains a point of ambiguity for the local authorities. The state records from 2022 mention a second individual named Sarah Miller, who was a 32-year-old biologist studying local bat populations. Sarah was stationed in a remote cabin near the Clinch Mountain Range, where she spent several weeks collecting data on nocturnal migratory patterns. Her logs mention that she discovered several strange markings carved into the trees surrounding her research site during the first week of her stay. She reportedly captured several audio recordings of a voice that seemed to mimic her own vocal patterns from the previous evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the audio, but the archive notes suggest that Sarah became increasingly paranoid about her immediate surroundings. County files from 2015 describe an incident involving a park ranger named Marcus Reed, who was 45 years old at the time. Marcus was tasked with patrolling the northern boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains, where several campers had reported seeing flickering lights in the distance. He arrived at a clearing near a decommissioned fire tower and discovered a collection of personal items neatly arranged in a circular pattern. The items included a digital watch and a pair of spectacles that appeared to belong to a missing person from 2012. Dispatch logs indicate that Marcus requested immediate backup after hearing a heavy breathing sound coming from the darkness just beyond his flashlight beam. Some locals claimed that the fire tower was the site of a forgotten settlement, but official state records show no evidence of any historical structures. Marcus reported that he saw a tall figure standing perfectly still near the base of the tower, but the figure vanished when he approached. The county file from 2009 mentions a similar encounter involving a group of hunters who were tracking deer in the same region. These men reportedly abandoned their equipment and fled the area after witnessing a series of blue flashes emanating from the forest floor. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the flashes, and the terrain was later declared off-limits for several months following the incident. A third individual, named James Bennett, was a 50-year-old retired police officer who enjoyed solo camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the spring of 2016, he planned a 5-day excursion through a section of the forest known for its treacherous slopes. James was equipped with a high-frequency radio and a detailed map of the region that he had used for over 20 years. Archived notes indicate that he sent a brief transmission on the second night, stating that he had found an unmarked cave entrance. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp static noise that the dispatch center was unable to filter or identify using standard equipment. Search teams arrived at the coordinates of the cave entrance only to find that the opening had been blocked by a massive rockfall. They discovered James's radio sitting on top of a flat stone, but there was no sign of a struggle or any physical tracks. Records conflict about whether the rockfall was a natural occurrence or if it had been triggered by an external force during the night. Some locals claimed to hear a muffled tapping sound coming from behind the rocks, but the sound was never captured on official recording devices. The state records from 2017 officially closed the case as a tragic accident involving an unforeseen geological event in a remote area. Investigators later discovered a series of photographs on James's camera that depicted a dark corridor lined with what appeared to be rusted metal doors. The photographs were blurry, and the light source was insufficient to provide a clear view of what lay beyond the threshold of the cave. Dispatch logs from that period show that several unauthorized individuals attempted to access the site before it was permanently sealed by the county. The county file from 2009 mentions a local legend about a hidden facility, but no evidence of such a place exists. James remains missing, and the true nature of the unmarked cave entrance continues to be a subject of intense local debate. In the winter of 2018, a 29-year-old geographer named Thomas Vance traveled to the rural outskirts of Kentucky. Thomas was employed by a private environmental firm to map the underground water tables and limestone aquifers hidden beneath the rugged hills. He reportedly established a base camp in a valley that local residents often avoided due to the frequent presence of heavy ground mist. State records from that month indicate that Thomas made several calls to his supervisor regarding anomalous readings on his seismic detection tools. The readings suggested that a large hollow space existed directly beneath his tent, but no known maps indicated any subterranean tunnels. According to dispatch logs, Thomas reported that the ground beneath his feet felt like it was vibrating rhythmically every night at 3 a.m. He decided to document the phenomenon using a high-sensitivity microphone and a series of motion sensors placed around the valley floor. Archived notes show that Thomas recorded a sound that resembled a low-frequency hum that caused structural damage to his electronic gear. Investigators never confirmed the source of the vibration, but the county file from 2009 mentions similar reports from local farmers. Thomas was found 3 days later wandering along a remote logging road in a state of deep confusion and physical exhaustion. He reportedly claimed that he had seen a series of vertical shafts hidden beneath the thick brush that were lined with smooth glass. The state records indicate that Thomas had lost all memory of how he had escaped the valley or where his equipment went. Search crews returned to the campsite, but they discovered that the entire area had been swept clean of any human presence. Even the flattened grass where his tent had stood was now standing upright as if no weight had ever been applied. Records conflict on whether Thomas suffered from a medical episode or if he had encountered an undocumented geographic feature in the hills.